If the global nuclear order were to collapse, the International Atomic Energy Agency were to go defunct, its inspections not respected, all nuclear treaties were to be abrogated, nuclear materials bought and sold freely on the open market. If this were to happen, which I think is unlikely, but if it did, then the expansion of nuclear energy would not necessarily mean a rush to proliferation. Would nations rush to obtain nuclear weapons in order to protect themselves? No, I don't think so. Nuclear energy, as we've already mentioned, is one way to assist in decarbonizing the energy supply. But nuclear weapons are not the same as nuclear energy. The process to enrich uranium is the same, but it's a different manufacturing process on the far end, and the strategic benefit of nuclear weapons is pretty well non-existent at this point. Nuclear weapons simply can't be used. There's no benefit to using them because if you're trying to capture territory, if you're trying to avail yourself of resources, the nuclear weapons have just destroyed what it is you found valuable. And the nuclear winter theory, which states that multiple nuclear explosions would kick up enough radioactive fallout dust to shade sunlight and to possibly tank global agriculture for a few years, this really puts paid to the concept of deterrence. Deterrence rests on the idea of credible use, that if I have a nuclear weapon and you wish to attack me, you won't because I would use my weapon on you, but you know that I can't in this globally interconnected world. So my having nuclear weapons doesn't make me any safer.
If we see a collapse of the international nuclear order in terms of the IAEA or the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty no longer having sufficient authority or control over nuclear weapons materials, there is a risk of increased proliferation around the world. Now, to understand what happens in those type of scenarios, we need to understand what are the motivating factors behind states wanting to get nuclear weapons. It's primarily security. And so you actually have a nexus between security considerations at a national level, the availability of nuclear materials and nuclear weapons technologies, and not necessarily nuclear energy technologies, and also the remaining international infrastructure that we have. And so even if we don't necessarily have a global international nuclear order, the nations within the global order will still have a large amount of influence on countries' decisions to proliferate. In the case of the United States historically has been one of the leaders in global non-proliferation. We have supported international efforts, but we also make sure that in our dealings with other countries on nuclear power issues, that we promote non-proliferation best practices.
A lot of the institutions and norms that were developed, especially after World War II, are weakening the norm against the use of weapons of mass destruction. We've seen Russia now twice use chemical weapons in limited attacks. And then North Korea used VX chemical weapons. So these norms against use of weapons of mass destruction are breaking down, and that's very, very dangerous. The peaceful use of nuclear energy would break down as some of these international systems break down, like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which allows for peaceful use of nuclear energy and indeed facilitates it, and then the implementing organization, the International Atomic Energy Agency. If they were undercut, then it could be a much darker, scarier situation.
We're living in very uncertain times. There's an overarching theme of attempting to maintain world order as we see norms either on their way to break down or collapse entirely. One way it could go is that we could see more opportunities for things to go wrong. So from transportation to waste to security, if there are weak global norms, a question that comes to mind is, will the IAEA inspections hold as much weight? What would happen during a climate disaster or civil unrest? We do need these joint universal measures for security. I also believe that the more we don't address other general security threats, the more nuclear weapons and just general WMD threats grow. Not figuring out international security issues in general is more likely to push countries to want to head towards those capabilities, I think. We really are at a point where it could go in so many ways, depending on what happens with international treaties such as the NPT Review Conference coming up or the Nuclear Ban Treaty. Another thing, obviously, that's overarching and will affect this very much so is how the US, Russia, and Iran navigate their present tensions just in general. There's a lot to consider.
The spread of nuclear energy can be a boon for sustainable development, but it comes with proliferation risks. For that reason, the global nuclear order has been making a lot of efforts to ensure that nuclear energy is used for peaceful purposes only. And these efforts have worked, not perfectly, but worked because now we have only 9 nuclear weapon states, which is a lot lower than what people like including President Kennedy predicted. And therefore, I think I see a great value in sustaining the global non-proliferation regimes. However, there is one concern that I have when I think about this issue these days, which is that the dynamic in the global nuclear market is changing. Now, China and Russia are major nuclear vendors, while the US, France, and Japan, these traditional nuclear vendors, have not been very successful recently. So what's the problem here? I think that they have bigger say, as they have bigger share in the global market, nuclear market, and then they will probably have a bigger influence over global nuclear norms and rules. And this is concerning because I'm not really absolutely sure what the global governance will look like under the leadership of Russia and China, because unlike the United States, which requires recipients of American nuclear assistance to refrain from enrichment and reprocessing, China and Russia do not do that. And therefore, now China and Russia are major vendors, and the United States doesn't have much leverage vis-a-vis other other states that want to receive assistance from the United States.
The United States can help make sure that we have a seat at the table when it comes to any sort of non-proliferation decisions or any sort of weapons decisions that countries make, if we're participating in their commercial nuclear industries. Being involved at a commercial level with the commercial energy industry in one country actually gives you the entree to start having the security discussions that you need to have. And so if we look at a scenario where the global nuclear order starts to collapse, where there's clear incentives for countries to develop nuclear energy, we need to respond strongly with an aggressive foreign policy that assures those countries they do not need nuclear weapons in the first place, but also engages them on nuclear technologies so that they can make sure that the benefits that nuclear energy provides to their countries are not harnessed for ill. When we look at the nexus between climate change, on the one hand, nuclear nonproliferation, nuclear energy, there are scenarios that you can see that the world basically falls apart. Climate change is so severe that the global international order fails, that the fact there's so much nuclear material around could lead to all sorts of conflicts and states developing nuclear weapons. And to that, I would actually look at history. When we originally started the efforts at non-proliferation at an international level, there were concerns that 30 or more countries could have nuclear weapons by the 2000s. Today, the current number of states that have acknowledged weapons is 8. There's an additional country that's suspected to have them. We made it so that the international system, the US participating in that international system, disincentivized the development of nuclear weapons.
There are certain global problems that require global solutions, and climate change is obviously one of them. Countries like China and the United States, whether we consider ourselves competitors or not, have to work together to come up with a solution for that. And I would say the same is true of nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union and the United States realized that during the depths of the Cold War, and it's just as true today that a global problem like the existential threat of nuclear weapons requires a global response and countries working together. So we can't just pull ourselves inward and hide behind borders. These are questions, existential questions that require global leadership, global cooperation. Global institutions like the United Nations are under threat, and it's reversible. I do think so, and it's necessary to reverse it because these are issues that require many, many countries working together to address them. And without that, if this order crumbles, it's going to be a very dark world indeed.